Well, let's discuss what leaders should aim to achieve at this year's gathering in Davos, Switzerland. Professor Fu Jun from Peking University School of Government joins us in Beijing, and Dr. Jacob Kirkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, joins us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the program tonight. So since this year's theme is about reshaping the world, I'd like to start by asking you both, what should global leaders focus on right now? What kind of message should they send to the world from Davos? Professor Fu, let's start with you on this question.
Well, in that context, what is interesting is that for me to mention a new growth model report that will be issued at Davos. In that new growth model report, we emphasize the two parts. So we are not going to reinvent the old growth model. Some ingredients of the old model continue to be valid. That is, you have to have an open global economy so that you have a increasing degree of allocative efficiency. You also need to have a specialization so that that reflects a function of a different stage of development. And you also need to have innovation, competition, so that you continue to push the frontier of technology and a high level of investment. But added to those old ingredients, global leaders should be sensitive the following areas. One is natural resources need to be better priced in the sense that the price should reflect scarcity and the rising demand. And also negative externalities should be controlled by better regulations, and also intertemporal, intergeneration considerations should move into the center of policy considerations.
All right, Dr. Kirkegaard, your thoughts on what global leaders should focus on? Do you agree with Professor Fu's points?
No, I think the professor made a number of very important points. I would guess from my perspective, I would say that really what they need to signal from Davos is that they're finally going to take the move away from crisis management. And by crisis management, I mean we're now, we've just had the announcement of the Fed tapering. That can only be the beginning of essentially exiting all these extraordinary measures that were taken to prop up the global economy, at least in the advanced economies, in the aftermath of the crisis. And then the leaders, in my opinion, need to basically shift to a much more long-term perspective, which means, one, they had to deal with the main economic leftover from the crisis, which again, in advanced economies at least, are elevated levels of unemployment, very, very high levels of income inequality, and basically have to find a way, as the professor said, a new growth model. But this is a growth model that needs to be, at least again, in advanced economies, much more inclusive than the one we saw before the crisis and indeed in the aftermath of the crisis. And then the second big point, which I think global leaders really need to begin to address, is climate change. I think it is very disappointing that we have not yet seen a significant move in that direction, either from Davos or from any other major international gathering in recent years. So there's a whole host of things that we should see from Davos, but I must admit, I'm not keeping my hopes up.
All right, Dr. Kirkegaard, you talked about long-term challenges. I want to talk about that a little bit more because the World Economic Forum focuses on both short and long-term issues. How are global leaders doing in terms of balancing short-term challenges with long-term needs? Do they have too much of a short-term bias right now with all the sort of deficit spending and QE that we're seeing?
In my opinion, absolutely. I mean, I will also say that I think focusing on the short term was the appropriate thing to do at the height of the crisis. I think if you look at what was done during the crisis at the G20 in 2008, 2009, where a lot of globally concerted economic policies, emergency policies were put in place, this was exactly the right thing to do. But now that the crisis is abating, at least in financial terms, but not yet in social terms, the impetus or the onus of leaders is really to shift to that long-term perspective. And again, at least in advanced economies, I would say that by and large, leaders are failing to do so.
Okay. Professor Fu, you touched upon this in your first question. You've jointly co-authored a policy paper with Nobel laureate Michael Spence that was released by the World Economic Forum's Agenda Council on New Growth Models. You talk about the need of inclusiveness, which is one of the sub-pillars at the theme of the World Economic Forum this year, and sustainability. These two factors as much more important policy objectives than they are currently right now. How do we better measure these two aspects, you think?
Well, in the area of inclusiveness, the picture tends to be clear if we are looking at the growth prospects on the supply side. But if you look at the demand side, it is questionable. And for the economy to move forward, you need to have a reasonable balance between supply side growth and the demand side growth. Now, a lack of demand has implications for employment. And particularly, you're looking at those disadvantaged group of people, women, youth. This is a global phenomenon. So world leaders should look at those areas very seriously. It is to include them, then you have a better chance to increase the prospects of the demand side. And when you have a better match between supply side and the demand side, you have a better chance to move the economy forward, both globally and domestically. In sustainability, if you project the size of the growth economy, project the population, global population, and you measure the quantity of resources on this earth. Apparently, it's not sustainable. But those natural resources need to be better priced. The price should reflect the rising demand of those. Usually, what we see is you have a better price mechanism reflecting innovation, say labor-saving innovation, but we haven't seen enough in technologies developed to save Earth. So there must be a better pricing system. In a way, a sustainable growth model is a long-term model. It's an investment model that is with a long time horizon, with the principle that you do not diminish the real value, the core value of that model. You grow with zero or very little discount on the core of that model.
All right, Professor, real quick, I want to follow up. Do you think the political will there for governments to respect these two measures, sustainability and more inclusive growth, do you think the political will is there right now to respect these two measures more going forward?
Well, it is important for us to send the message out so that you raise the awareness of the problem, the serious problems, and in the hope that what will follow will be a high degree of political determination among national leaders to join hands, to have better cooperation to face the global challenge that we face.
All right, Dr. Kirkegaard, let's end with the latest global risks report from the World Economic Forum this year. A fiscal crisis apparently is identified as the #1 risk for the world in 2014. But like we just heard, the IMF just raised its global growth projections, and most advanced economies face more fiscal headwinds right now than emerging economies. How likely do you think are we going to see a fiscal crisis unfold this year in multiple countries?
No, I think a chance of a fiscal crisis is relatively low. There's no doubt that in pretty much every advanced economy, we now have very elevated levels of debt to GDP. I mean, in most countries, in fact, the norm is now somewhere between 80, 90 to 100% of debt to GDP. Now, compared to previously in history, that's a very high level. But at the same time, it's very clear that we will continue to have in advanced economies very low interest rates for the rest of this year and probably also in the coming years. So the risks or the cost of this debt is relatively limited. And at the same time, I think that despite the often sort of, flashy headlines and demonstrations in the streets, the reality is that at least advanced economies are relatively politically stable. So we're not going to have a political upheaval in an advanced economy then turn into a fiscal crisis. I think the problem is more likely to emerge in some of the emerging markets, where if you have a combination of rising interest rates from, for instance, the end of the taper, combined with the need for foreign financing, which basically means a large current account deficit, and then political instability. I think if you have those three ingredients, you could have a fiscal fiscal crisis in one or more emerging market during the year.
All right, well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Some great analysis tonight, gentlemen. Professor Fu Jin from Peking University School of Government and Dr. Jacob Kirkegaard from the Peterson Institute of International Economics joining us on the program tonight.